Why, hello, friends. I have dyed my hair black. This is something I've been wanting to do for quite a while now, but I did dye it kind of for this video, kind of not. This video just kind of gave me the little push that I needed to take the plunge and dye my hair black. And with that intro, if you're new here, my name's Brina, and today is Makeup and Murder Saturday, and it is also Halloween. So for today's video, I'm going to be doing a Morticia Addams look, hence the black hair. As always, I'm not going to be talking you through the makeup. I chose to do Morticia Addams because I feel like it's an easier Halloween makeup look that doesn't really need a walkthrough. And now that I've got that out of the way, let's get into today's story. Today we're going to be talking about Danny Rawling, aka the Gainesville Ripper. Danny Rawling was born on May 26, 1945 in Shreveport, Louisiana. He was the first child to Claudia and James Rawling. Claudia was only 19 when she had Danny, and his father, who was a Shreveport police officer, was extremely abusive towards not only his wife but also his children. It was very widely known that James did not want to have children, and he was always very quick to remind Danny of this fact. In 1955, when Danny was 1 year old, he began crawling, which you would expect would be a very big milestone in any first-time parents' lives, and that they would be extremely ecstatic about this, but instead, James critiqued the way Danny crawled, and when Danny didn't fix how he crawled, James beat him for it. This would be the first time, but not the last, that James would physically abuse Danny. It was around this same time that Danny's younger brother Kevin was born, but that did not at all help Danny to stop becoming the victim of his father's frustrations. Instead, it only seemed to get worse because James already had this 1-year-old he didn't want, and now he has a newborn. And being a police officer, he knows very well that he cannot just go around beating a newborn. So he takes his frustrations out on his wife Claudia and Danny. By the way, I probably should have mentioned I'm doing a little bit of a more modern take on Morticia, so hence the very bold and big eyebrows. Okay, so back to Danny. When he was about 5, his dad, remember he's a cop, while on duty he finds a puppy and he decides he's going to bring it home for his family. Seems like a nice enough gesture. Danny is extremely happy to finally have somebody in the house that he can confide in. Him and the puppy become extremely close, but the puppy is not immune from James's wrath. Soon he begins taking his anger out not only on his wife and kids, but also on the puppy, who Danny adored. Eventually, James's abuse took its toll on the dog, and it died in Danny's arms. I'm sure this was a very traumatic incident for Danny, and it would affect him like it would affect anybody. And then it's a few years later, and Danny fails the 3rd grade for basically a bad attendance. He apparently was getting sick a lot, and he just missed way too much school, so he failed. His school counselors, when he failed the 3rd grade, had described him as, quote, suffering from an inferiority complex with aggressive tendencies and poor impulse control. Around the same time, his mom suffered a nervous breakdown. So Danny was just not having a good year. Then when Danny was 10, his father decided it was time him and his brother Kevin learn how to drive. Being 10 years old and his first time driving, Danny obviously did not know what to do, and the vehicle was a stick shift, so Danny was clueless about how to use the clutch, which just made his father very angry, and James slapped Danny in the face, berated him, and then took him home. This same year, Danny once again failed the 3rd grade. When Danny was 11, he found that he could use music as a way to cope with what was going on at home. He really got into gospel music, and he loved to sing the hymns. He even taught himself how to play guitar at some point, and he eventually began making up his own songs. But it was around the time that Danny really started to find himself getting lost in music that his parents arguing took a very scary turn. One day, during one of their many arguments, Danny walks in on them, like I'm sure he has 100 times before. This time, things don't end like they usually do. His mother, Claudia, who just can't escape this horrible life that she has seemingly made for herself, locks herself in the bathroom while James continues to yell at her through the door, and she uses a razor blade to slit her wrists. James eventually breaks into the bathroom, but when he finds his wife lying on the floor bleeding, he doesn't stop yelling at her to call 911. Instead, he continues telling her how horrible she is, and Danny is fearing that his mother is dying and his father is just going to essentially kill her. So he instead gets his father to turn his anger onto him. So instead of beating Claudia, James beats Danny. Eventually, James calmed down and Claudia got help, but she ended up spending a little while in the hospital due to her suicide attempt. With his mother gone and having just witnessed her trying to kill herself, Danny's extremely fragile mental state takes a turn for the worse. He no longer finds comfort in the gospel music or playing guitar. Instead, he finds drinking. Danny's drinking problem was said to have began when he was only 11 years old. Then when he was 12, him and his friend had stolen some alcohol, like they often did, but this time his father caught him. So I'm sure you can imagine things were not going to go well for Danny once he got home. James dragged Danny home by the neck. Then he had some police buddies of his come and throw Danny in jail for 2 weeks. He was only 12 years old. When Danny's 2 weeks were up, he got out of jail and he went back home, but only briefly. He refused to talk to his mother, and he ended up grabbing some of his things and running away from home. He spent the night in the woods, but he went home the next day when he got hungry. Now, Danny is 14 years old, and he's been caught peeping into his neighbor's bathroom window trying to spy on their daughter for not the first time, but the second time. The first time, the dad kind of let it slide. You know, he's 14. Boys will be boys, as they say, but don't buy into that. It's a scam. Boys just need to be taught right. So the neighbor told James what Danny had been doing. Of course, Danny was beat for this. And Danny would also later say that this was around the time that he began having sexually violent fantasies. After the beating, Danny decided he no longer wanted to live and attempted suicide, but he failed. And this is when he says he began developing multiple personalities. By the age of 17, Danny had dropped out of school, gotten his GED, and he has now decided he wants to join the Navy. Eventually, he convinces his father to sign him up, but he fails the Navy enlistment test and ends up joining the Air Force instead. While in the Air Force, Danny begins experimenting with drugs, and after being arrested for drug possession, Danny is dishonorably discharged from the Air Force after less than 2 years of service. After Danny got out of the Air Force, he decided he wanted to live with his grandfather, and while living with him, Danny actually found some stability through church, and he kind of seemed to have found his purpose in life. He seemed to be doing better than he had ever done throughout his whole entire life. So things are very much looking up for Danny. And on September 6th of 1974, Danny marries a woman who he actually met through the church named O'Mather Halco. Yes, that is actually her name, O'Mather. And the two ended up having one daughter together. After getting married, Danny started working 2 jobs so he could support his small family, but the stress of a young family and 2 jobs eventually got to Danny, and he began going back to his old erratic, strange ways. He ended up leaving the church. He even started abusing his wife and his daughter. No longer having church to keep Danny stable, he went back to his old ways and he started drinking, smoking marijuana again, and he also picked up some strange new habits. Danny would often go out without telling O'Mather where he was going or when he was coming back. Sometimes he'd be gone for hours, sometimes he'd be gone for days. On one occasion, he was even brought home by the police after they caught him peeping through some windows. Then, just 3 years into their marriage, Danny caught his wife having an affair with her ex-boyfriend. When he caught them, he became extremely angry. He pulled a gun on O'Mather. Eventually, she was able to calm him down enough that he no longer was pointing the gun at her, but then he pointed it on himself until she said that she was not going to leave him. O'Mather lied, though, and following this incident, she filed for divorce, and the couple was officially divorced about 6 months later. The divorce basically sent Danny into a downward spiral. Danny was no longer able to hold down a job. He was either constantly quitting or constantly being fired. So he took up a life of crime as a way that he thought was easy enough to make a living. During his life of crime, Danny became extremely depressed, not only about his divorce, but just about how his life had turned out in general, and he turned to armed robbery as a way that he hoped he could end his life. Basically, he wanted suicide by cop or even by gas station clerk, but he never ended up getting caught in the act, or nobody ever shot him. So basically just another one of Danny's plans has failed. Then in 1979, Danny robbed a Winn-Dixie in Columbus, Georgia, and about half an hour after the robbery, he was arrested, and he had confessed to not only the Winn-Dixie robbery, but a series of robberies throughout Georgia, Alabama, and Louisiana. Danny was given a 6-year sentence for his crimes, but he escaped after a few months, although he only made it about 100 yards before cops shot a warning into the sky, and that made Danny stop running really fast, and back to prison he went. Danny was released on June 7th of 1984. Following his release, he went home to Shreveport to his parents' house. And let's just say this was probably not the wisest choice he had ever made. Danny's stay with his parents did not last very long. Him and his father inevitably got into another fight, and Danny left. But before he left town, he broke into a young girl's house after he had watched her for several hours. Danny claims that after he broke into her house, she began crying, and he felt so terrible that instead of raping her like he had intended to, instead that the two had a cup of coffee, sang songs to each other, and then had consensual sex. I'm not buying it. Then he claims after this whole incident happened, she drove him home. But Danny says he was scared she was going to call the cops, so he fled the state. Now, if it was consensual and everything was all hunky-dory, y'all sang songs together, why are you so afraid she's gonna call the cops, Danny? The next few years of Danny's life consisted of a lot of the same past behavior. He committed crimes, he went to jail, he got out, committed crimes, repeat the cycle. By November of 1989, Danny was working at a restaurant, but Danny missed a lot of work, and when his boss confronted him about this, Danny responded by threatening to kill him. Obviously, Danny was fired from this job, and that night he made a decision that would completely change not only his life, but the lives of those around him as well. That night, he broke into the home of 24-year-old Julie Grissom, her 8-year-old nephew Sean, and her 55-year-old father Tom. Danny murdered all 3 of them, and when their bodies were found 2 days later, Julie's was on a bed with her legs spread open. Her body had also been mutilated, and since Danny had no connections to Julie or her family, the prime suspect in this murder case became Julie's ex-boyfriend, Hal Carter. And then we're going to fast forward to May 18th of 1990. Danny is back home at his parents' house when him and his father get into yet another fight. And Danny is completely fed up with his father at this point, and he pulls a gun on him. Danny ended up shooting James in the stomach and the face. James lived, but he lost an eye and an ear. Wanted for attempted murder, Danny once again flees Louisiana. After a few months of basically life on the road, Danny was going from state to state, just committing crimes and on the run. Eventually, he makes his way to Florida. After he arrives in Sarasota, Danny thinks it's time that he gets a new identity. So he uses some papers that he stole from a house in Louisiana to illegally change his name to Michael Kennedy Jr. While in Florida, Danny is still committing crimes, like robbing gas stations and convenience stores. So he decides he's going to set up camp in the woods. I don't know if it was intentional or on accident, but he ended up setting up his camp within about a 2-mile radius from all of the places that he had robbed. Eventually, Danny made his way to Gainesville to see what kind of crimes he could commit there. And on the early morning hours of Friday, August 24th, 1990, Danny, who was armed with a knife and a pistol, broke into the home of 2 freshmen at the University of Florida in Gainesville. Inside were 17-year-olds Sonia Larson and Christina Powell. First, Danny stumbled upon Christina asleep on the couch, and after standing over her for a while, he decided to check out the rest of the house, see who else or what else was there, and that's when he came upon Sonia Larson, who was asleep in her bed. When Danny found Sonia, he covered her mouth with duct tape, bound her hands together, and then stabbed her to death. Danny then went back downstairs to Christina, who was still asleep on the couch. He duct taped her mouth and bound her hands just like he did to Sonia. Then he cut her clothes off of her. He raped her, and once he was finished, he turned her over so she was face down on the ground, stabbed her 5 times in the back, killing her. But Danny wasn't finished at these 2 girls' apartment. No. Instead, he decided he was going to take a shower. So he cleaned himself up, gathered up all the evidence he could find, and he left on the bike that he had showed up in. While he was biking away, Danny stopped at a dumpster to ditch the evidence, and that's when he realized he had grabbed Christina's nipples and they were in his bag. He says that when he saw them, they made him sick to the stomach, but I don't believe that. The next day, Danny broke into the home of 18-year-old Krista Hoyt. She wasn't home at the time though, so he decided he was just going to wait in her apartment for her. When Krista came home, she had no idea what she was walking into. Danny immediately put her in a chokehold and subdued her. Then, like he had done with Christina and Sonia, he put duct tape over her mouth and then bound her hands. Then he cut her clothes off of her and raped her. Once he was done with her, he turned her over, face down on the ground, stabbed her 5 times in the back, killing her, just like he had done to Christina. When he was finished killing her, he also cut her nipples off, but that wasn't good enough for him this time. This time, he cut her head off and placed it on a shelf overlooking her body. At this point, all the students of Gainesville were very aware of the serial killer amongst them, and people began taking extra precautions to try to stay safe. All of the women at this point who had been murdered were petite brunettes with dark eyes, very similar to that of his ex-wife. These were also the type of women that he would target when he was raping women. So clearly, Danny was holding some kind of resentment towards his ex-wife. So like I said, students began taking precautions. Many began changing up their daily routines in case that whoever was committing these murders was stalking their prey beforehand. A lot of students slept in large groups so that way they would maybe be safer. Many students even chose to withdraw their enrollments and transfer to other universities. But most of all, Gainesville saw a huge spike in gun, mace, and lock sales. But none of this would be enough to stop Danny. And on Monday, August 27th, Danny broke into the home of 23-year-old Tracy Pauls and Manny Tabawada. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right. Probably not. So, my bad. First, Danny came across Manny, who was asleep. Danny decided to take out Manny to avoid anybody interfering with him and Tracy. But Manny was not going easily. He put up one hell of a fight, but eventually Danny was able to overpower him, and he ended up stabbing Manny 30 times. Overkill much? The fight between Danny and Manny was enough to awake Tracy, who had come down the hall to investigate the noise when she saw Danny, and she quickly retreated to her bedroom, trying to barricade herself in before he could get to her, but she was too late. Danny was able to push his way past the door, and once again, he put duct tape over her mouth, bound her hands, cut her clothes off her, and raped her. When he was finished with her, he turned her face down on the ground, stabbed her 3 times in the back, and killed her. At this point, Danny realized he needed to flee Gainesville because he was leaving behind a series of murders and he didn't want to get caught, so he stole a car and left the city. It was around the same time that police had come across his makeshift campgrounds where they found cash with pink dye on it, as well as other stolen goods and audio tapes. Now, I don't think police listened to these audio tapes right away, but these tapes contained Danny's audio diaries where he was hinting at the murders as well as the other crimes he was committing. But I don't know, police may have listened to them right away and they just didn't know who this campsite had belonged to, since Danny had clearly abandoned it. On September 7th of 1990, Danny was in a stolen car headed for Ocala. Once he got there, he decided to rob a Winn-Dixie. He walked in holding a pistol, shouting, "This is a robbery, get out your money." He forced the manager to empty out the safe, but he was unaware that while he was doing this, the bookkeeper of the Winn-Dixie was on the phone with police. So, as Danny was leaving the Winn-Dixie, police were pulling in. This led to a high-speed chase, which led to Danny crashing the stolen car and police arresting him. Meanwhile, back in Gainesville, police have zeroed in on a suspect in the murders. They think Ed Humphrey is the sole person responsible for the 5 murders, because he had a history of mental illness and he was arrested on August 30th for assaulting his elderly grandmother. So timelines fit up around the time of the murders. Ed had been threatening people in public as well as talking about Satan a lot, and he was carrying knives. He also had a lot of scars on his face, so people just thought he looked scary and wanted to get the scary guy off the streets. So everyone believed that he was the type of person who would commit these horrendous murders, and all suspicion fell onto Ed. He was currently in jail, like I said, for assaulting his grandmother, and his bail had been tremendously jumped. It did not at all fit what he had been in jail for. So clearly something fishy was going on behind the scenes with police and Ed Humphrey. Then on January 1st of 1991, in a fit of rage, Danny ripped a toilet from its mount and threw it across the room, which prompted his defense attorney to ask for a psych eval, and he moved to have Danny's guilty plea withdrawn because remember, Danny was in jail for not only robbing the Winn-Dixie, but also multiple other crimes that he had committed while he was in Florida, but his lawyer's efforts were moot. And Danny ended up getting convicted of 3 Tampa burglaries, and he received a sentence of 3 life terms plus 170 years. So while police were investigating Danny and these murders, they started to realize that the weapons he had on his possession at the time of his arrest were a match to marks left behind at the crime scenes in Gainesville. And after a few months, they were able to positively link semen back to Danny. But the lead prosecutor on the case in Gainesville was still convinced that Ed was responsible for the murders in some way, and now he began putting out a theory that Danny and Ed were working together. Somewhere along the lines, Shreveport police hear about Danny's arrest, and they reach out to police in Florida to see if they can compare evidence to see if this unsolved murder of Julie, Sean, and Tom was maybe linked to Danny, because they knew that he was in Shreveport around the time of the murders. Now he's been arrested for 5 other murders, so they're thinking maybe they've got something here. They found multiple similarities between the crime scenes, such as the fact that Julie's body had been mutilated and posed, just like the women in the Gainesville murders. It would take a few years before police knew for sure if Danny had committed the Shreveport murders, but eventually he confessed via a handwritten letter that he gave to Florida police to give to the Shreveport police, where he confessed and apologized for his crimes. Now, between the times that Danny was charged with the Gainesville murders and actually went to trial, he attempted suicide several times, which led him to be sent to the psycho ward in the Florida State Prison. He met Sandra London, who he eventually got engaged to, and the two wrote a book together called Making of a Serial Killer. Finally, in February of 1994, Danny was set to stand trial for the 5 murders in Gainesville, but the day before his trial started, Danny just keeps pulling out the stops. He's got all the crazy bottled up and he's letting it all out now. But the day before he was expected to stand trial, Danny unexpectedly decided to plead guilty on all charges. Then on April 20th of 1994, Danny was sentenced to death. At this time, he was also diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder, borderline personality disorder, and paraphilia, which is a condition characterized by abnormal sexual desires, typically involving extreme or dangerous activities. I mean, it makes sense. At some point between February, when Danny decided to plead guilty, and April, when he was sentenced, Court TV did an interview with his mother. During the whole entire interview, his father could be heard off camera, just yelling nonsense. Yes, the two are still together. Claudia had attempted to leave James several times, but she was so young when they got married, she just always ended up going back. But following the interview with Court TV, James and Claudia got into a very, very bad fight where James ended up kicking Claudia out at the end of it, and Claudia died shortly after this incident. On October 25th of 2006, Danny Rawling was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison after the Supreme Court had rejected his final appeal. For Danny's last meal, he chose lobster tail. I don't like lobster. Gross. And when asked if he had any final words, Danny chose to sing a gospel hymn. And that's how he went out. So if you watched my video from a couple weeks ago, I didn't have one last week due to technical difficulties. I was actually going to tell this story, but I filmed it, had a problem with the audio, and I decided to save it for this week. But like I said in my 2 weeks ago video, the rest of the month of October, I wanted to tell the stories of murderers who inspired horror films. So if you're wondering what this one was the inspiration for, it was the first Scream movie. If you haven't seen Scream, spoiler alert. So if you remember in the movie, Sydney goes on stand saying that her mom's lover, Cotton Weary, was the one who killed her mom. The similarities in the stories are that Ed Humphrey and Hal Carter, I think was Julie's boyfriend's name. Them two were wrongfully accused of the murders, so that there's a correlation, plus just a mass murder spree of students, another correlation. I mean, I don't really think that it's supposed to be like an exact replica of the Gainesville Ripper murders, but either way, Danny Rawling is who inspired Kevin Williamson to write the Scream movie. So this is my Morticia look. What do you think? Did I nail her? But like, throw a 21st century spin on her, because I was not going to be living with those tiny little eyebrows. I wanted to go big and bold with it, because I feel like this is maybe what a 21st century Morticia would look like. Let me know in the comments what you are for Halloween this year, and happy Halloween. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. That really helps me out. And don't forget to subscribe before you go. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Bye!